today's topic is very timely. Thinking about China and recent China, contemporary China, we realized that China that we know 5 or 10 years ago is not necessarily the China that we see today. There's been a lot of developments, and China is a major global player, certainly in many ways, economically speaking and politically speaking. Before we get started, and I briefly introduce all of our speakers, panelists here, I want to thank our sponsors. We come to you as a group of CIBERs. These are national centers of excellence designated by the US Department of Education in international business. And there's 10 CIBERs that are sponsoring. You've seen their names on the slides that preceded my opening comments here. So we have with us 4 very seasoned and expert speakers helping us understand contemporary China. We have Guangming Fan Rui. Welcome, Guangming. We have Yawei Lu. Welcome, Yawei. And we have Edward Wang. Welcome, Edward, and welcome, Sebastian van der Weg. Guangming is you've seen from her background, her bio, she's been practicing corporate law for many years, based here in Atlanta. Yawei is at the Carter Center, senior policy advisor on China. Edward is an educator here at Georgia State University. And our moderator today is Sebastian. Sebastian is a communications expert, having spent many years in multinational corporations as well as the United Nations. So with that, thank you all, our panelists. I'm looking forward to a great conversation, and we'll have a few minutes at the end of our conversation today to cover some of your comments and questions. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Sebastian.
Thank you very much, Tamer. And welcome everybody from throughout the world. Very excited to have this webinar today. Certainly, as Tamer mentioned, a very interesting topic. A lot to go through in an hour, so we'll try to keep it brief and interactive as we possibly can. A quick word before we get started about what the webinar is about and what it's not about. It is really about understanding contemporary China. It is not about doing business in China, strictly speaking, although it will be of interest to the business people. It is also not about Chinese-US relations, strictly speaking, although questions on that topic are welcome. It is really about understanding contemporary China. And so before we get started, in the spirit of it being very interactive, we wanted to actually turn it over to all participants and ask you what you're most interested in hearing about today. And while we do that, we'll go around. So I would kindly ask Rebecca to pull that poll up. And while you fill out this poll, I would kindly ask all of our speakers, our China experts, to quickly introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background in China, their upbringing in China, and what brought them to the US. So we'll kindly start with Dr. Yawei Liu.
Hey, Sebastian, this is Yawei. I came to the United States in 1987 when I was bored by what I was doing. Really, it's not boredom, it's the lack of mobility, so to speak. So I went to Hawaii, studied for 2 years there, and then finally ended up here at Emory, because when I was looking for a degree program, my advisor said, have you ever heard of Emory? I said, no, I've never heard of Emory. He said, well, go look for it. And it turned out that Emory is nicknamed Coca-Cola University. And I also got a Woodruff Fellowship, which means, since that point, back in 1989, I stopped drinking Pepsi Cola at all. That's my introduction.
Thank you, Dr. Yawei. Guangming, if you kindly introduce yourself.
Sure. Before I begin, I just wanted to take a moment to express my shock and outrage and sadness about what happened in Atlanta on Tuesday. The senseless killing of 8 people, including 6 Asian women. And we must do all we can to stop hate. And what we are doing today is one of the ways that we do that. And we're promoting understanding, and applaud GSU-CIBER for hosting this webinar, and all of you for participating. I hope this understanding will help bridge the relationship between US and China. So I was born and raised in China. So both China and the United States are my beloved countries. I lived in each country for more or less about the same number of years, with maybe a few more in the US. So I was born and raised in the South, very close to Hong Kong. After college, I worked in Beijing for a few years as a journalist before coming to the US at the beginning of 1989, before Tiananmen Square. So as a lawyer, I spent about 10 years doing US-China cross-border transactions, helping Chinese companies coming to the US and US companies doing business in China. I still go back and forth. In my current job, I don't do anything with China now, but I still go back and forth. I still have families there. I look forward to sharing with you my understanding and experience about China.
Thank you, Guangmin. Dr. Edward?
Hi, my name is Edward Wong. I'm a lecturer at Georgia State University Institute of International Business. I was born in China, went to study in the UK when I was 13. I have a PhD in international business from the University of Leeds. My research focuses on international joint ventures, Chinese state-owned enterprises, and knowledge transfer.
Great. Thank you, Edward. And Rebecca, if I may ask you to pull up the results of our quick poll here. So I hope you can all see that. We have a fair bit of interest in hearing about the impact of COVID-19, although I do think that has been widely covered in the media and elsewhere. Chinese multinationals abroad, their challenges and successes. We do also have on the line Leanne, who stems to us from Georgia State University, who can actually help us answer some of those questions, who specializes in Chinese multinationals abroad, as does Edward. So we certainly have the expertise here to address that question. How businesses should deal with the Chinese government, always an interesting question. China's digital revolution, regional difference within China. So glad to see there's interest across the board in these topics. I would ask all participants to freely ask questions. We can't promise we'll get to all of them or in the order that they were received, but we'll certainly do our best. So with that being said, let's close the poll and get right to the first question, which is probably the easiest one on that list, and that is regional differences within China. And you know, we as Westerners, we tend to think of China as one homogeneous country that is pretty standard in the same way we think about Brazilians, the same way we think about Americans, but there's really a lot of regional differences and disparity within China. So would you like to comment on that a little bit? Like, what do you find most interesting that people miss about China, about the differences within China? And maybe we can start this question with Guanmin.
Well, so as I mentioned, I was born and raised in the South. And then I worked in Beijing, which is in the North, for a few years before coming to the US. So I certainly can tell you that the South and the North are very different parts of China in terms of cuisine, which a lot of people probably already know, and just the culture in general, the way people interact with each other is very different. In the South, people are more, they keep to themselves a little bit more. They're more practical, very pragmatic. In the North, people tend to be a little warmer. They tend to be, they interact more, I should say. In terms of business, I think because of the proximity of Guangdong province to Hong Kong, I think the people in the South started to develop a sense of business, some business acumen earlier, which is not to say that people in the North are behind by any sense, because they certainly have caught up very quickly. But the economic development in China started in the South, partly because of policy, and I think partly because of its proximity to Hong Kong.
Edward, I know you grew up in the North, I think, right? Would you agree with that? People in the North are warmer?
Yes, certainly. I grew up in the North. I think our perspective of the South of China is, I agree with Guanming, is more liberalized, perhaps less government control, and people are more business-driven, business-minded.
So in some ways, it's a flip the coin of the U.S., right? People would argue. How about you, Yahweh?
Well, when I talk about the regional differences in China, number one is linguistic, the language difference. My dad was from Anhui, and my mom was from Wenzhou. I always wonder when they initially dated back in 1949, how did they communicate? Because if my mom started speaking Wenzhouhua, nobody at the house could understand. It's more difficult than a foreign language. The second is, I think they're stereotype of, where are you from? For example, one stereotype is people from Shanghai, we were told never ever deal with them because they're so calculating, you won't be able to come out on top ever. I do think Shanghai people in the past, they are more arrogant, they think they're the center of China, and people from the North, they're just country bumpkins. And of course, people in Guangdong, they like to eat. They eat everything that flies other than plane, and they eat everything with legs other than the desk. These are stereotypes.
Yeah, I want
to go ahead.
On the topic that Yahweh mentioned, that people, when they meet strangers, they like to identify where they're from. And from a legal perspective, I should say that one of the reasons I see that people do that is because for the longest time in Chinese history, China did not have a mature legal system. So when you're interacting with people, other than relying on the legal system to protect you, a lot of times people rely on trust. And so knowing where people are from, and if they're from a place that you're familiar with, then it's a little easier to build trust. This is changing. But that is, I think, in my perspective and in my experience, that was part of why that was the case.
So speaking about the legal perspective, because we've had quite a bit of interest in that, do you feel that the legal system is changing in China? Is it getting? It's a big topic, of course. You have patent protections, you have labor law, you have regional differences. And you're the expert, but how do you see that evolving? And then the second part of that question is, how do you see that for impacting businesses doing, or foreign businesses doing business in China?
The legal system is most definitely changing and maturing. Before China joined the WTO in 2000, China's legal system was not something that we consider as a legal system. Is very much government control. It's still very much government control now, but at least the written laws are a lot more in line with international practice, if you will. As part of China's accession to the WTO, it was subject to a lot of requirements. Part of it was to update its laws. So it's a lot more, you mentioned intellectual property, technology is, China has, it's hard for people to admit that probably, but it is doing much better. Because part of the reason is because there are a lot more innovation coming out of China now than before. When your own interest is on the line, it's a lot easier to enforce intellectual property protection laws. China is actually very good on the books in terms of intellectual property protection. It's about enforcement. Enforcement is where it's behind, but it's getting better.
In what areas do you feel that are still lacking?
The one area that I think it will take quite a while for China to catch up is property law. As you know, real estate is controlled and owned by the government. So there's a lot of, from my perspective, there's a lot of questions, ambiguities about how properties are treated long-term. So I'm curious to see how that will evolve.
Edward, anything to add from a legal perspective question?
No, I don't have too much experience regarding the Chinese legal system. One thing I can add is an interesting point. Volkswagen actually paid for the building of the China Bureau for patent in the 1980s, and the German legal experts helped China to draft the first patent law. So once upon a time during the honeymoon between China and the West.
Interesting, interesting. Dr. Yahweh, you know a lot about the regional differences within China. Does the legal system, as we think about it, is it pretty uniform in China, or does it differ if you're in Shanghai or let's say in the west of the country?
No, I think there's probably no regional difference, how the law is practiced. But what I'm concerned is not the difference, but is the similarity, is that wherever, there is law, there's also the party, and the separation between the party and the law is the most important. So the emergence of a more independent judiciary legal system is more important than anything else for China, to be respected and to be a real meaningful part of the international order.
And where do you see that independence at the moment? Is it non-existent, or is it pretty much the same as it was 15 years ago?
I think Guanming probably has more to add on that. I think China has a long way to go, and where China is, maybe a little bit more. It depends on which law we're talking about. I think Guanming mentioned about property law. There are criminal procedures, and there are corruption cases. It all varies from nature of the lawsuit. And I think for me, as a non-legal person, I think the most important thing for China, and for China to be respected globally, is the legal protection of freedom of individuals, is the due process. If I own something, that something cannot be taken away by the state without a due process. And this seizure of property happens, in the name of you being corrupt, in the name of you being bribed, or in the name of you try to bribe other people, and that person, there's no way for that person to defend himself. Most of the time, the person, according to the legal, to the lawyers, to the government, is confessed. He basically pledged guilty. We don't know how was he coerced. Was he tortured? All these things are not transparent, and that's very important. A part of China becoming a responsible global stakeholder.
Understand. Thank you, Guanming. I know he mentioned you. Anything to add to that question?
You mentioned the regional difference in terms of the judicial system. One thing I wanted to make sure people understand is that in the US, we have a republic system where each state is a sovereignty. In China, it's different. They have a centralized system. So everything is controlled by Beijing, except that China is so big and there are so many layers. When it trickles down to the local levels, things change. Even though on paper it's one big central controlled system, in practice, that's not the case. There's a lot of local control. How things are done in one place is absolutely different than the other one. For example, when I was doing US-China cross-border transactions, forming an entity in Guangzhou and forming an entity in Shanghai. Our entire, the requirements are different, the process was different. So yeah, it's hard to, like doing business in China, really you have to ask where you're going and you have to find the right help in that location.
There was one interesting question here, which do foreign companies ever have a chance to have a hearing in English? Probably not, right?
Well, so good question. So I would, if at all possible, I always advise people, US business people, to choose arbitration instead of litigation. Because with arbitration, China has an international arbitration committee, and the arbitrator pool, the pool of arbitrators are from all over the world. And you can specify in your contracts that you want English as the arbitration language. And you can specify that someone from a neutral third country be the arbitrator. So you have a lot, there's a lot more way to control independence and neutrality than using the judicial system.
Okay, we just had a question, and I think it's interesting. Somebody TED Talk, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, understanding the rise of China. Do Westerners really have to change their paradigm trying to understand China, or is this changing? Edward?
Well, I think even for Chinese, we have to change our paradigm to understand China. So yes.
Dr. Yahweh, anything on that question?
I don't exactly know what paradigm this person means. You have to change the paradigm to understand China. I guess, here we're talking about changing paradigm of US-China relationship. That paradigm shift means, before Americans believe engaging China, and particularly to get China into a more market economy oriented, then China will become more liberalized. And that paradigm.
I think what he was talking about is more on a personal level. Do you have to change your paradigm in terms of how people think and how they interact with Chinese as a foreigner within China?
I don't know. Again, what is a personal paradigm? Because people used to, when you think about China, China is poor, China has a lot of people, China is always being a victim, in the past, from 1840 all the way to 1949. And now it's changed. China has risen up. China is challenging the United States. China maybe one day the largest economy in the world. I don't know whether that's personal or that's a more global view. But China certainly has changed in the past 40 years, and that speed, really warp speed, and that has a lot to do of China being integrated into the train of globalization.
Yeah. And talking about China changing, I think the question alluded to that, because a lot of in my earlier talks with Tamer about this topic as well, it came up that some of the textbooks that were written even 5 years ago are not as much relevant today. The speed at which China is changing is tremendous, and certainly the digital revolution is part of that. We all hear anecdotes and stories about facial recognitions, about the use of technology in fighting COVID-19 in the way that the Chinese economy is perhaps undergoing a digitalization more than any other economy in the world. How is that impacting the dynamics between people and the social dynamics, if you will? For me, is very interesting, and maybe Edward, we can get some thoughts on that with you, because you were probably there most recently out of everybody.
Me?
Yes.
I haven't been back for many years, but one thing is the elimination of physical cash. That's why I heard like people don't carry money anymore. They use their phones to pay for everything. And I can share a quick story actually. My parents-in-law stayed with us for almost 10 months last year during the pandemic. They eventually got back to China. So after 3 weeks quarantine, they finally got a green code. In China, now you have to have a green code on your phone to go anywhere. And they finally got the green code, and their cars are not registered because they were here in the US. So my father-in-law drove his car to the immigration office. And within 10 minutes after he hit the road, he found that he was surrounded by 3 police cars. And 10 officers came out and stopped him and said, hey, who are you? Why are you driving an unregistered car on the street? Which apparently is very unusual in China. And they told him like the system alert the control center that one day the CCTV camera pick up the registration plate and saying, hey, there's an unregistered car on the road. So that's, I guess it's not only a problem with China, but also a world problem that we are facing to find this balance between convenience, public safety, individual privacy, and government power. So it's also in the West, but perhaps in the West, we are more concerned about the power of big tech firms. But in China, I guess one very important or interesting thing we found from this pandemic is the tolerance for people living in China and people living in the US is very different. How we value and prioritize convenience, public safety, privacy, and government power is very different. So if a Chinese family been told by the local government to stay home for 2 weeks or even a month, most people do it. They're convinced it's for the greater good, and also it's like. And more important than tech, I think, is that the Chinese government have the capability of enforcing these restrictions. The smallest government branch, I think, is 街道办事处, the street office, which played a huge role in this pandemic. And all these factors are imaginable in the US, of course.
Now, you mentioned the problem of balancing privacy with an overbearing state into your life that knows all aspects of your life, including your vehicle registration and everything as soon as you drive out of your driveway. Do Chinese actually consider this a problem though? Because I think in the West we would certainly probably consider it a problem and it would be a big issue. But what is the mindset? Like, are people just, that's a fact of life, they kind of not question it?
I think many people embrace it for the public safety concerns. It's very hard to commit a crime in China because there are CCTV cameras everywhere. But obviously, China is such a vast country, there are different groups, and people think differently. So without detailed research, I can't really tell whether the majority of people agree with this or not.
Yeah, Guangming, would you agree with that your family in China, presuming that you still have family in China, they don't really see it as an issue?
Well, keep in mind that not very long ago, 30, 40 years ago, China was still pretty strictly controlled by the Communist Party. So most people in China grew up in that kind of environment where government plays a big role in your life. So it's hard, from a Westerner's perspective, it's hard to understand why people would accept that kind of control. But you have to keep the historical background in mind that isn't it's getting better actually than how it was before, right? So this isn't anything unusual from the perspectives of most Chinese people. But to your question, though, yes, I mean, it's a lot more commonly accepted, like government interaction, government control in all aspects of life is a lot more commonly accepted in China than in the United States, in personal lives and in business as well. And you asked, the question you initially asked was how digital development has changed people's interaction in China. I think it is not any different than how digital development has changed interaction in people in the US, but maybe to a much greater degree. So it's not uncommon to see people at meetings looking at their phones and like even answering phone calls because they literally live in their digital world, almost more so than in the actual world. So it is a custom, I would say, that is frustrating for a lot of Western business people doing business in China. So just a warning.
Understand. Yeah, we all have a little shorter attention span these days. Dr. Yawei, anything to add on the digital topic?
No, I think I agree with both Edward and Guanming is that most of the Chinese people understand, you know, what is more important. Is it life or is it private, is your privacy? And I think on that account, the Chinese people sort of accept it, but that doesn't mean people don't have concerns about the digital intrusion, particularly government directed digital intrusion into their lives. And I attended a webinar, the law professors at Peking University, and it seems like, you know, the legal profession now is pushing the government to come up with a law so that, you know, there's better protection of privacy. I think that also has a lot of impact on how the outside world sees China, you know, to make China look like 1984, which is probably worse than 1984, is not a good reputation for China to have. And you don't want to be known as a surveillance state. And that, you know, is going to take time for the Chinese government to make changes so that there is better protection of private privacy.
It's interesting you raised that surveillance state, because certainly that term gets thrown out a lot.
It is.
Guanming, sorry, you had something to add there.
Very, very quickly, Yahweh mentioned privacy law. I just wanted to point out that on paper, China has a very strict set of privacy laws. It's a matter of implementation and enforcement, which that's what is lacking. But on paper, actually for a long time, Europe considered China to be a lot more restrictive in terms of privacy protection than the United States.
I think what I mean by privacy law is not just private, but the data issue, you know, how data is going to be collected and how data is going to be used. You know, I think that's a more urgent issue.
And we had some questions around the practical question about the restrictions on Google. Google's still not able to operate freely in China, or is it right now able to operate?
No, it's off the limit, but China does, you know, there are people who are more equal than others in China. So for example, Duke campus in China, then on the campus, you will have access to Google.
You have access.
And, you know, Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University, within the compound, you will have access to Google, to Twitter, to Facebook, to others. But outside that compound, some of the hotels above a certain floor, you are outside the Great Firewall. Because, you know, they want to provide convenience to business people, you know, particularly international business people. So again, people like to talk about, you know, US trying to decouple with China. Many here says, you know, US did not start the decoupling. China really started the decoupling by blocking Google and other websites from the West.
That's a good point. There was a question that came through about whether or not the poor, quote unquote, have access to technology the same way in China as rich people do. Do you see a divide in digitalization between different layers of society within China, between the privileged few at the top of the economy and those at the those near the bottom? Or do you see that it's kind of everybody has a smartphone, everybody has access, everybody really benefiting? Because there are, you know, when we talk about the downside, there's also, of course, many benefits of a digital revolution. Are they also benefiting equally?
I think so. On paper, I think on February the 23rd, I remember that was the day when the president of China announced that abject poverty now is eliminated totally in China. You know, I haven't been to China's countryside. I'm pretty sure there is a digital divide, particularly, I think, among older people. So maybe there's also an age digital divide. Older people tend not to be able to navigate, you know, how to use digital devices and things like that. But the e-commerce, according to the Chinese office, has a lot to do with the eradication of poverty in China.
Good. So we breached on the economy a little bit, and I'd like to switch gears because people talk about, you know, China overtaking the U.S. Within 5 years to become the world's largest economy. I think they just surpassed the number of companies they have on the Fortune 500. They surpassed the U.S. But a lot of these are state-owned, and they don't necessarily have the same characteristics. And I know we have an expert in our midst here, Dr. Edward, who knows more about the competitiveness of these firms and what drives them and what their impact is on the Chinese economy. So, Edward, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, last year, China had 124 companies that included as the Fortune Global 500 companies, 3 more than the US actually. But many people didn't know that 73% of these biggest Chinese companies are state-owned. Even though private Chinese companies have much higher average return on assets and return profit margin, but 84% of total Chinese FG 500 companies' assets are state-owned. One thing is, in 1963, the concept of bird cage economy was raised by the Deputy Premier Chen Yun, who played an important role in economic reform in the 1980s. The bird referring to the private business sectors and the cage referring to state-controlled economy. His argument was that if you hold the bird in hand and not let it fly, the bird will die, meaning too much control will diminish the private sectors. But if you let the bird set free without a cage, it flies off. So the government needs to build a cage around the bird so the bird will not be out of control, yet have room to grow and maneuver. From my observation, it is actually the dominant logic behind the construction of the Chinese economy to this day. Gave private business some room to grow, yet build a cage so it will not be out of control. And this cage is made of regulations, government involvement in many industries through state-controlled capital and state-owned enterprises. As we can see that most dominant firms in many industries are state-controlled in China, from energy sectors to banks to automotive, telecom, and chemicals. Yet we have very limited understanding of these enterprises, how it works, what are the decision-making mechanisms, what are their motivations, and how do they measure their performance, etc. There's a recent special issue in the Journal of World Business on state ownership, pointed out that there is a great urgency to resume our study on state ownership and SOEs, as most previous studies focuses on Western SOEs, which mostly got privatized in 1980s and 1990s. So the knowledge we learned from those SOEs may not apply to Chinese SOEs.
And where do you see the trend in terms of state-owned enterprise? Is the trend going more in that direction or less in that direction?
I think in the 1990s, most Chinese will think there'll be less in that direction, and eventually the economy will be more westernized. But now I think it's a reverse. But there are also some great concerns for Chinese economy for their over-reliance on their SOEs. The share of state-owned enterprise capital was 194% of China's total GDP. That's far exceeding all other major economies in the world. And in general, that's not considered a positive sign. The IMF estimates that the productivity of Chinese SOEs are only 80% of their privately owned competitors. Because of that, China's current factor productivity is only 30% of most advanced economies like US, Japan, and Germany. So unless China can increase its total factor productivity, its new investment return rate will continue to diminish. So to me, I think it makes towards more privatized and liberalized economy, but I think it's not only an economic problem that we are talking about.
But Edward, isn't efficiency maybe not the end goal? Maybe the end goal is to employ more people.
Yes, that, and also I think stability, political-wise, there are many concerns. So, but that's why I'm saying that it's very interesting to see the true motivations of these companies and how they measure their performances. Yeah.
Dr. Yahweh, anything from your perspective that stands out in terms of how state-owned enterprises dominate the Chinese economy?
I think that's a major obstacle between U.S. and China trade and economic relations. That's what is being referred as structural issues. Will China reform the SOE sector? Will China stop subsidizing SOE? Will China be willing to make foreign companies, compete with these SOEs on the more playing field. These are all concerns. So I do agree with Edward that in the past decade or so, 国进民退, the more SOEs are in play and there's more aggressive policies against the private sector. But China has to reform this sector. Otherwise, it's not going to be easy to have a better relationship with the US and with EU countries.
And do any of you know how many of the state-owned enterprises actually have partnerships as well with multinational firms outside of China?
I studied the automotive industry, and most state-owned automotive industries have multiple partnerships with different foreign car makers.
Now, bringing them back to the topic of arbitration, because I know there was a question on it earlier. If you're arbitrating with a state-owned enterprise, do you have any chance and subsequently in a court? Guanming, maybe you want to talk about that one. I mean, it's a difficult question.
The second part of your question is, do you ever have a chance to what? To win at the court?
How does that, the arbitration, once you settle an arbitration, how does that then hold up in court subsequently, that decision?
So if your contract provides that arbitration is your exclusive dispute resolution method, then that the decision of the arbitrator is binding. And China and the US have a treaty where under which court decisions or arbitration panel decisions are enforceable in the other country. So at least on paper, that's the case. And like I said, you as a foreign business, you definitely have, you will have a lot more control in terms of who will hear your case and in what language the case will be heard than relying on the court. The judicial system is still, there's still room for improvement and materializing. It's still very much government control at this time.
Great.
In terms of leveling the playing field, I just wanted to point out one positive development in terms of the law, and that is that for years, just until recently, foreign companies doing business in China was subject to entirely different laws. So a lot more restrictive and a lot more requirements that you have to comply with. Recently, China is abolishing those laws that apply specifically to WFOEs or foreign invested enterprises. And so at least on paper now, the same set of company law would apply to both domestic companies and international companies. So that is, at least on paper, is a positive development. We'll see how it is enforced and applied.
Now, we can't talk about the legal system without also talking about how businesses interact with government. And I know the three of you all have expertise in this area, but if you were to advise foreign companies who want to set up shop, who are doing business in China, where do they emphasize their relationship and who do they pay most attention to? Is it the local level? Is it the state? Is it the party itself? Or do you strategically form a partnership while entering the company? Like, how would you advise companies to deal with the Chinese government? And I know, Dr. Yave, maybe you can start with that. I'm sure you've got that question a lot.
No, I'll yield to Edward and Guanming on that question. When you open up a shop in the city, obviously you need to have a good relationship with the government. To ignore the government is basically equivalent of committing suicide in China. But I think the emphasis of the government now, at least, is to lower the threshold and also to reduce the transaction cost. And again, it varies from place to place. Maybe in Hainan, now the entire province of Hainan is a free trade zone. It's a lot easier. You go to one place, you'll be able to get everything completed over there. But if you go to my city, Xi'an, probably more difficult for you to set up shop. But the government is everywhere in China. You just cannot ignore the presence of the government.
And it is a very delicate balance to make, because in the U.S. as a U.S. business, if you're doing business in China, you have to be mindful about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It follows you wherever you go. So on the one hand, Yahweh is absolutely right. You have to have good relationship with the government at all levels. But on the other hand, you cannot cross the line of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So, so the devil is in the details. I usually advise people to cultivate a good general relationship over a long period of time. Don't try to start developing the relationship when you need something. That will make it a lot easier to cross that line. So
where does the power lie, so to speak? Is it really at the local level? Is it at the national level? Depending on the size of your business, I guess. I mean, if you're a smaller business, do you really emphasize those local relations?
It also depends on what you're trying to do. Most of the time, I would say that the local relationships are a lot more important than people in Beijing.
That's interesting. Would you agree with that, Edward? Local relationships?
Yeah, well, it's a problem many MNEs, there are some high-profile cases are facing at the moment. For example, like some fashion brands, even NBA, firms hate to choose size. But some firms are increasingly concerned about having to choose between the Chinese market and the home market. But I think we discussed there are many layers to Chinese governments. If something happened, we often find that when a firm is not in good terms with the central government, the local government sometimes are willing to help you to smooth that, because your investment and employment you bring matters to the local officials in their performance. So yeah, and also I think in terms of business, all problems are short-term problems. NBA had a problem with China. It was suspended for almost a year on TV, but now it's business as usual. I think the bottom line is China wants FDI. It welcomes FDI for the foreseeable future.
I also, could I just interject here? It's not just the relationship with the government, but more and more is the relationship with the people. A recent development is Chloe, the director who produced the movie, and she was nominated for the best actor. And then people themselves were able to find out the interviews she did with other people, in which she said she doesn't like China anymore. And that's why she becomes a US citizen. And the next development would be the government now will have to look at whether that movie, No Man's Land, is going to be released in China. But even more important is the big blockbuster. She is involved. Whether that will be, I think Edward mentioned about NBA. That's not a government initially. It's not a government issue. It's the people issue. People started saying, they're talking about Hong Kong, and then this noise online basically become a pressure on the government to take action, because otherwise the government will be accused of kowtowing to the West. So I think more and more, it's not just a government issue, it's also a people issue.
That's an interesting thought, right? Because you're talking about almost like a democratization, right? You're talking about the people having a voice and an influence, although it is a little bit of mob mentality.
It is, talking about a paradigm shift. I guess this is another paradigm shift. China is not a democracy for sure, but China does have a very vibrant online sector, and the censorship usually doesn't censor patriotic, xenophobic, nationalistic discussion, and that's danger, out there for all the foreign businesses in China, particularly when it comes down to Hong Kong, to Xinjiang, and to Taiwan.
Yeah, there was a comment here on the Q&A about how the Chinese government perhaps also influences that online chatter. But You have also, I think, spoken about there actually being local elections in China. Is that, they have some of the large, is that still the case?
Oh yeah, I mean, China has more elections probably than any other country in the world. China, 600,000 villages in China every 3 years. By law, they have to conduct free and fair elections to elect a village committee chair. But
Wow.
beyond that, China has 5 layers of people's congresses. At the township level, at the county level, at the district level, at the city, provincial level, and national level. Particularly at the township and district, county level, people's deputies are also elected directly by the people. But the issue is the voters don't really know, particularly when we talk about congressional, the People's Congress deputy elections, they don't know because they don't care. They don't know who the candidates are. Elections at the village level are different. That's more competitive. But then the issue is most of the young, capable villagers are no longer in the village. They are migrant workers in the cities. So even though the elections are probably free and fair, but it really doesn't have any consequences. And the village doesn't have finance. The finance now is being controlled by the township. So they're just very complex issues when we talk about governance and political reform issues in China.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that insight. We have about 8 minutes left, and I'd love to switch gears a little bit to China's role in the world economy and into how we've all seen it. After COVID-19 hit, initially there was a large cry out to make people's supply chain less dependent on China. I think what happened in reality is that China became even more part of people's supply chain because they opened faster their economy than many other economies. So how is China currently using that to their advantage in places like Africa, Latin America, in Europe? And how are their multinationals doing? Besides the supply chain, I know we're talking about two different things, the supply chain for Western multinationals and China outward to the world, but how are they currently doing and how is that changing? Edward, I know you talk a lot about multinational. Would you like to address that a little bit?
Well, I think the full consequence of COVID on the world economy is yet to be seen because we are still in the mix of it. But it seems like China, instead of a tumble, it became a ladder for Chinese economy to get closer to the US economy size-wise. But in terms of how it's going to play out, that's a $1 trillion question. I really don't know. But the thing is, I recommend a great documentary movie called American Factory. I think it was made in 2019. It's about a company called Fuyao Glass, built a factory in Ohio, and how they had to deal with the cultural clash with labor unions and local governments. I think if you're interested in this topic, it's definitely worth to have a look. I think it's available on Netflix.
Guangming, I know you're in the private sector, but where do you see the Chinese firms doing in the world economy at the moment?
China as a whole is definitely a lot more assertive. Technology innovation is improving. So China has, for years, maybe over a decade, tried to become a more consumer-driven economy. Not entirely successful yet, but it's moving toward that direction. I actually don't have a lot of insight on how China's multinationals are doing on the global stage. I would defer to Edward and Yahweh on that.
Yeah. Yahweh, we could also draw on Lian here in a second. I know she's done quite a bit of research in terms of Chinese multinationals. But Dr. Yahweh, anything to add on how China is using, we've all heard stories about COVID diplomacy and using their vaccines to better their name in places like Brazil. But how are Chinese companies actually benefiting from that? Or is it more their political standing that they're after?
I think the issue for the Chinese companies is that Chinese economy is growing. The companies are doing great. They recovered much quicker than their counterpart in other parts of the world. The issue is where the market is, and that's why the Chinese leaders started talking about dual circulation. So, the capacity is not the issue. The issue is when you manufacture these things, where you're going to sell them. Vaccine is one big issue. China does produce a lot of vaccine, but the data of their trial is not readily available. That is causing a lot of concern among the international community. So the vaccine diplomacy, I think it's sad to see that the U.S. and China should work at least to coordinate more in terms of where they can work together to distribute vaccine. China can certainly become more transparent. If you want people to use your vaccine, but the government, I think, now is using vaccine as a leverage, saying if you take Chinese vaccine shot, you'll have easier access to China. I think that's the wrong way to go. And that, if you play your vaccine diplomacy that way, that's counterproductive. That's not the how a global citizen stakeholder should behave.
It's a bit of a zero-sum game, isn't it?
It is. It's not just China playing that game. I think U.S. is also playing that game. U.S. is talking to the Quad. It's saying, we have the technology, Japan has the money, Australia has the logistics, and the Indians are going to produce all the vaccine to supply the whole world. And they want to shut China out of the whole vaccine. That's impossible. But the way U.S. does that certainly has emboldened China, to be more active in terms of, this counterproductive vaccine diplomacy. So it's not just China's fault. It's also the fault of the other countries, including the United States.
Understand. Thank you for that answer. We've got a couple minutes left, so I want to give each one of you a chance to have any final words or final say. I know we haven't gotten to every question that I've seen come through. I've seen a lot of questions come through, and my apologies for that. We will try to follow up as much as we can after the webinar. But any final thoughts on understanding, coming back to the objective of the webinar, which is understanding contemporary China, if you will. Are there any topics you feel that in your preparation for this webinar you really wanted to stress that maybe we haven't talked about to wrap up? And perhaps I could start with you, Guanming.
So again, I applaud everyone for participating and wanting to know more about China. I think China and the United States, being two of the largest countries in the world, will have to stay in a good relationship for the good of the world. And so every little bit of understanding between the two countries is good. So I would just encourage people to continue to do that. China is ever changing, and so our understanding of China will have to do the same. We'll have to change along the way.
Thank you, Guangmin. Edward?
Yeah, it's been a great conversation, and I agree with Guanming that this is exactly what we need at the moment. I'm thinking because of the current political climate, I think it's very important for us to rebuild trust between China and the US, starting from ourselves. And I hope the audience enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Dr. Yahweh.
Yeah, I would like to use my personal experience to go back to that paradigm question. I was an English editor before I came here to the US, and people asked, what do you do as English editor? I said, I was going to visit all the professors who came back from United States or United Kingdom. I looked through all their books. And then if there are books that I think has a market in China, I took that book, I read it, and then I asked people to translate, and then they're going to be published. That's the standard practice when I was the editor from 1982 to 1987. Now, if you like a book and you want to translate that, for the Chinese readers to enjoy, you have to purchase the copyright. There's just no way our practice is going to be tolerated at all. What that says is not just what Edward and Guanming said, China is changing, is that China, to a certain extent, China is changing for the better. And on the intellectual property issues, certainly China is going toward the direction that it will become a a responsible member of the international community. To continue to say China, has engaged in theft without, restraint is not a paradigm or lens through which you're going to look at China.
Excellent, very insightful. Thank you, Dr. Yawei. Thank you, Guanming, Edward, everybody. I would now like to turn it back to Tamer and hope you can join us for the next session.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, Guanmin, Yahweh, and Edward. It's been a phenomenal learning experience for all of us. It's clear that we have to continue to better understand China, complexities at many levels, and China cannot be ignored. It's a major player economically, politically speaking, and ambitions in China are huge. We've seen not just a vaccine diplomacy Yahweh talked about, but Belt and Road Initiative, for example, which started some years ago. China definitely wishes to be a global player. It's just that they have a different way they are interacting within China with their own stakeholders and citizens and other global players on the global arena as well. So a lot of lessons here, lots of good insights. I really appreciate it. It's been illuminating and refreshing. So I want to thank you all, and I also want to invite you to next week's webinar, which will have a discussion of research in international business, in particular theory development from case studies. Stay tuned for that. We will follow with a very brief survey before you log off. Please respond. We've had over 300 people joining us today from around the world, from many different time zones, and we appreciate the following of GSU-CIBER's webinar series. So thank you all again, and we'll see you next week for the next webinar. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.